which we will deal with later in the session. I first want to share some personal notes on where we stand with the wage issue, since work on living wages has been going on for more than a decade. First, I want to mention the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the OECD guidelines. They clearly state the role and responsibilities of businesses to respect the human rights to fair wages. This responsibility exists independently of the responsibility of governments to set minimum wages. So in cases where the legal minimum wages fail to meet the living wage level for workers in production countries, businesses have an obligation to remedy and bridge that gap. Yet, although rights of workers and responsibilities of businesses are clear, the everyday business practice is far from realizing these living wages. The COVID pandemic has worsened the situation dramatically. The Pay Up campaign by NGOs has been necessary to press fashion brands to pay the bill just of the orders that were produced for them already when COVID hit. An estimated $15 billion has been recouped and paid to garment factories worldwide. Urgent money for workers on the brink of survival. Never say again that public campaigns for justice only lead to small money. And when governments do raise minimum wages, such as in India and Pakistan, suppliers not always automatically comply with those wage improvements. This account of injustice does not mean that there has been no progress in the field of living wages. Compared to 2011, when supply chain responsibility for living wages has been adopted in the OECD guidelines, real progress has been made. First of all, in methodologies for calculation of living wage benchmarks. And this enables the calculation of the wage gap between actual wages and living wages. By now, we have living wage benchmarks for many garment producing countries and regions. The ILO has developed a similar methodology to calculate adequate minimum wages, which helps governments to set their minimum wage on a decent level. The EU is about to agree on a new minimum wage directive, which should have a major impact on the wages of underpaid garment workers in EU countries. And there's more to come with the EU Sustainable Corporate Due Diligence legislation. More than ever, global brands are being expected to know and show the wages in their supply chain and to act on the substandard level of wages. Initiatives for responsible business conduct, such as the Fair Labor Association, the UN Global Compact, and the Industry We Want, have made living wages a priority issue. So are investors, for example, in the platform Living Wage Financials. None of the major garment brands can have missed the issue. Some 30 plus are a member of the ACT initiative, working with Industrial on realizing living wages by collective bargaining on industry level and by responsible purchasing practices. This session will discuss exactly those purchasing practices. Another example of progress is that those practices are clearly written out by now. This session will show you some practical first-hand experiences with a difficult challenge. We will hear the perspective of the Indian supplier Pure Cots, represented by Trisha Gulati, the brand Puma, represented by Veronique Rochet, the extensive work on living wages of the Fair Labor Association, represented by Renee Bowers, the ACT initiative, represented by Bea Maria Ruoff, and we will start with researcher and co-founder of the Fair Wage Network, Daniel von Whitehead, who will tell us about his groundbreaking research on living wages and purchasing practices. Daniel, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Joss. Hello, everybody. Very nice to participate in this session. I'll share my screen. And I would like, in fact, to start this session. I hope you can see my screen. Can you see it? Joss?
Yes, I can see it. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So yes, so I would like to, I was asked a bit to set the scene. So I would like to start, with a simple but maybe provocative questions. Why do we care about purchasing practices? Why is it important to address purchasing practices? And I would like to, to give you two main reasons. First, because purchasing practices are often poor in global supply chains. And the second reason is because we know now that purchasing practices have a direct impact on working conditions, especially on wages. And we also know that the lack of wage institutions are an aggravating factor. So let me share with you, this first slide, which is showing precisely why wages and working conditions are not that brilliant in global supply chains. You can see on the left side, we compared through case studies. We did 31 case studies we did in 5 countries, in Bangladesh, China, India, South Africa, Turkey. We tried to compare the average wage among suppliers with, market rates, the sectorial wage. And you can see that, from the literature, you could expect companies to work for supply chains to pay higher wages. You can see that this is not specifically the case. It's true that wages were found to be slightly higher in China and in Turkey, but you can see that average wages of suppliers in global supply chains were found to be much lower in Bangladesh, India, and South Africa. And you can see on the right figure, we compare this time the average wage provided by suppliers with the living wage thresholds that we have. And you can see that in all 5 markets, the average wage of supplier is below and well below the living wage threshold. So this to tell you that we have a phenomenon of poor wages in global supply chains. And the second slide, about the second reason why we should address purchasing practices, because we now have enough empirical evidence to show that there is a direct impact of different types of purchasing practices on wages, working conditions, temporary work, and also outsourcing. And you can see that here, from a sample of nearly 1,500 suppliers, we could see that 37% of suppliers were concerned by inaccurate technical specifications from the buyers. More than 50% reported at least 50% of their orders having insufficient lead times. 39% had to accept prices below production costs. And then 49% of them reported not to receive any support to implement the code of conduct, advised, and requested by the buyers. And of course, this has an impact on wages. You can see that inaccurate technical specifications from econometric work we did have detrimental effect on wages by 15%. You can also see that prices, when suppliers have to accept prices below production cost, this leads to minus 16% of wages at the end of the supply chain among suppliers. Interestingly, when they accept orders without sufficient lead times, this leads to an increase of 7% of wages. But this is because overtime hours have to increase precisely to respond to this insufficient lead times. And clearly the fact that suppliers do not receive support to implement the code of conduct is also putting them under pressure. And of course, they have more difficulties to pay wages and to pay decent wages. And you can see that there is also an impact on temporary workers. The fact that you have inaccurate technical specification is leading to an increase in temporary workers by 10%. And also the fact that suppliers have to accept orders with prices below production costs is also leading them to increase the recourse to temporary workers, because it's a way to recover their margins. And of course, to face the pressure in terms of timing that they have, within, the delivery of orders. So this to tell you that there is a direct impact of specific purchasing practices, technical specifications, lead times, pricing, support or not to the implementation of the code of conduct on wages, on temporary workers, on outsourcing, on working time. And I would like also to show you this graph, which shows in a way the correlation between the living wage payments and the lack of wage institutions. You see on the left side in yellow, this is the minimum wage compared to the living wage. And in orange on the right side, this is the average wage paid by suppliers compared to the living wage. And you can see that there is a sort of correlation, which means that where minimum wage is pretty low, especially compared to the living wage, suppliers will also pay low wages and will also have wages below the living wage. And you can see that this black line is showing an indicator that we have developed, which is the strengths of wage institutions. And you can see that where wage institutions like minimum wage, wage bargaining are stronger, the gap between the minimum wage and the living wage is lower, like in China, where you have over the last few years a sort of development of wage institutions like minimum wage more frequently adjusted, and also of wage bargaining with collective bargaining. So this is a bit the picture. Of course, it's not totally rosy, but what is positive, and I would like really to insist on that, is the current brand's mobilization to pay a living wage. Clearly, no doubt, wages became topic number one in brand sustainability program. The payment of a living wage became the main target of many brands, as the Fair Wage Network precisely helped them to achieve, what we call a living wage gap analysis. And also we can provide them, when they are compliant with the living wage payment, we can provide them with the living wage accreditation. And, we have the example of Unilever, for example. They will announce next week that they succeeded to be accredited as a global living wage employer. And I'm sure that more brands will follow. We know the public commitment of L'Oréal to pay a living wage. We know the commitment by Puma, and we'll have the case in this session. So clearly, there is a movement, and the investors are also asking the brands to pay a living wage. The Dow Jones Sustainability Index now has questions about the payment of the living wage. At the same time, and this will be my message today, this objective to pay a living wage cannot be fully achieved without some changes in purchasing practices. And you could see that, in pricing, in terms of lead time and so on. We have good examples. I remember Arena, that tried to increase lead times with their suppliers. Patagonia tried to have programs with their suppliers to reduce overtime hours. So there are positive examples. And here, clearly, I know that it's a very sensitive topic, but it is important to focus on prices because prices, of course, is at the core of the business model, but it's not the only concern. Lead times, for example, are very important because they have a direct effect on overtime hours, and they impede, in fact, the payment of a living wage without overtime hours, just with the basic wage. So it is important to address different types of purchasing practices, not only pricing, but lead times and also technical specifications. So I will stop here. We will have a few examples of brands that will confirm this movement. And I hope that, we'll be able, to draw some conclusions and recommendations on the basis of these examples. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for this overview. We will now move to our panelists. For a change, we will not start with the practice of major fashion brands, but at the other side of the supply chain. The supplier Pure Cots in the north of India took the initiative to become a sustainable textile factory. In 2020, They became the first sewing factory to be certified under the Fair Trade textile standards. With the support of Fair Trade, the textile factory has been working on living wages. Trisha Gulati, head of operations at Pure Cuts and an experienced human resource manager, will tell us more about this positive example. Trisha.
Thank you, Josh. I'm elated and glad to be a part of this forum. And as we represent all these factors, I was, completely agreeing to what Daniel was saying. So in the year 2019, when we really signed up with Fair Trade, it was then they introduced us to this concept of living wages. Till then, we were aware of the terminology, but what exactly it is and how it is calculated and what are the benefits and all, Fair Trade introduced us to that. Hearing the concept, we were, we have 100% intentions, and we wholeheartedly agree to the fact that living wages is absolutely important for better living standard of workers, because primarily all the factories depends on the hard work and labor that the workers put in. But yes, similarly, on the parallel lines, we do have certain challenges. So in the year when we began in 2019, we had no workers above the living wages benchmark. And it's the kind of a small achievement for us that today, where we stand after 2 years, 20%, 21% in fact, of our workers' workforce is above the minimum, living wages. So yes, but there's a gap. So I would not say we have reached to 100%, but we have a 5-year strategy where we'll ensure that we meet this benchmark, and 100% of our workers are enrolled into it and are above living wages. Now the thing is that the challenges, if we talk about certain the scenario like how Daniel was talking about, in India we have legal binding of minimum wages. So every 6 months the minimum wages increases, and they cover the inflation. So it's not just a yearly mechanism, it's twice a year that we have to increase the minimum wages. When we talk about minimum wages, it has PF and provisional tax also that we don't include in living wages, but yes, it's included in the minimum wages. And the entire liability of that is on the employer. So that if we consider throughout the seasons, even if we make profit or we don't make profit, it's a legal binding for us that no workers could be paid lesser than the minimum wages. So that's again a quantum of cost that we have. Still in the last year, if seeing the COVID situation, we ensured and we made sure that 100% of our workers get full salary pays. We did not deduct a single amount of penny for these workers, and we ensured, despite there were leaves and a lot of absenteeism, and the factory was on and off certain months wherein the business was not growing in that way, and there was challenge because we could not allow workers to come in the factory and work. But still we ensured that in the right spirit of being like a family to these workers, we ensured that the salaries were paid on time and no deductions were happened. In fact, last year, despite all this pandemic situation, the average increment that we did for our workers was 17% on an average, which is considerably good if you see it in the context of the Indian territory. But still, if today we talk about the deficit that we have from the actual wages to living wages, our current deficit is 4% of our sales. And it has a lot of reasons behind it, because as you all know, cotton prices are like, humongously increasing. And that definitely adds to the costing of our product. But on the same time, the buyers wants to, steeply negotiate with us on the prices. And they want to maintain the kind of rates that were before. So despite knowing that the cotton prices have humongously increases, and at the same time, Pure Cuts has to also maintain the premium quality that we are known for. So we can't, deflate to that, and we can't, reduce or, have any alternative for that. So we have to maintain that quality. We have to have the full working force in place. We have lead times. We have everything. But that is wherein, when we, even in the right spirits, when we want to give away a contribution towards our workers as living wages, it becomes really burdensome on the employer itself, because the entire cost is on us. So though we are the primary, responsible employer is the primary responsible one for living wages, but what we expect is, that suppliers, buyers, and even the end customer should come together and support it. So in a way, if we talk about, we have a couple of, buyers with us. Like I would specifically take names like Melaware, who has been very supportive and has contributed a good premium towards Pure Costs to support the living wages. And we really appreciate their collaboration on that. Similarly, we have another buyer, which is Kowtow, which is again collaborating with us, and they understand living wages and they're happy to, contribute towards the same thing. But yes, it's not the 100% buyers that we have. We have many more buyers whom we are trying to create awareness, and whom we are trying to collaborate with, make them understand that, how we could all pull in together as a community and, improve the standard of living for the workers. At the end of the day, it's the workers that manufacture these lovely garments, and, people across the globe wear it, appreciate it, and feel comforted. So if a smallest bit also gets back to them, they really feel engaged and happy about the fact that, people are loving their garments. And that's the basic, I would say, intrinsic support and motivation that they get. So of course, we all as a company support them. But when we tell them that, you have got compliments from Germany, or maybe like, European countries, and people are loving wearing your garments, and this is a small token in the form of living wages, how you're also growing and your standard of living is also growing, of course, they feel really happy about it. So in that way, we feel that though more than 100% Pure Costs is, striving really hard, and with 100% of our intentions, we wish to, have 100% living wages standards with workers. We also request our buyers and the end customers to, pitch in here and collaborate with us.
Yeah, Trisha, that's your story. Thank you.
Yeah.
Lovely, warm story, a positive story. We listened to the experience of an individual supplier. We know that living wage is a joint effort of brands and suppliers. In order to reach scale, many organizations need to collaborate. Fair Labor Association is an initiative that combines individual efforts of brands and suppliers with a joint approach. The FLA Living Wage approach has not gone unnoticed. Last year, their approach won 2 awards for social innovation. René Bouwers, Senior Director of the Social Compliance and the Fair Labor Association, will tell us about the work on living wages. In the past, she worked with Indian artisans who taught her to apply the lens of economic justice. In order to make progress on living wages, we must see this as a human right, she says. René, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Trisha, as well. I really appreciate your comments about the need to share responsibility. And that's something that at the Fair Labor Association, we absolutely take to heart. I'm going to quickly share my screen. And I apologize, I have a bad cold, so please bear with me if my voice is quite scratchy. I'm the Senior Director of Social Compliance, as just said, and living wage at FLA, we use the word fair compensation, has been one of the most difficult and also urgent issues that I have dealt with in my career. And at FLA, we initially made a commitment to living wage in 2011. Like every good human rights journey, ours started with a commitment that we made within our organization, and then all of our member organizations including the 50 of the largest apparel and footwear brands in the world, then adopted this commitment as well in their own internal codes of conduct. And the important thing about this commitment is that it recognizes that fair compensation and living wage is a worker right, a fundamental right. And I think that we all are in absolute agreement about that. The question then that we've all been grappling with is, how do we get there? It is urgent and it is important, and we need practical, scalable steps. When I first started this work with FLA about 5 years ago, I'm just going to be totally honest and transparent with you all. We were paralyzed. I think this image probably resonates with a lot of you. We were paralyzed by information. The companies we work with were paralyzed by information. I heard again and again from suppliers, as well as from brands, that they did not feel they could move forward because they didn't know what workers were making. They didn't have a good, solid view of the full compensation package for workers, and they didn't know what a living wage was. Everyone was fighting over, benchmark methodology, and therefore they just weren't doing anything or didn't feel that they could do anything. So what we had to do as an organization was overcome the paralysis, and we did something really difficult. We actually threw away a bunch of our tools that we had developed, and they were really good tools. They were rigorous. The problem was they were too complicated, and we heard again and again from factories and from assessors that it was taking them days to gather the information. The information wasn't always accurate because they couldn't easily access it. It was contradictory. So what we did was we threw things away. We started again with a group of very knowledgeable practitioners using what we had learned so far. We created a new tool that uses information that factories, assessors, and workers can easily access in much less time. Therefore, it's scalable, and it's something that I should mention because it's important. It includes all aspects of compensation. We then developed an online dashboard, so all FLA companies and suppliers now take the information they've gathered in the tool, they upload it, they can compare in their own supply chain actual average wages against living wage benchmarks, figure out what the living wage gap is, share that data internally in order to set priorities, and act. We use publicly available benchmarks consistent with the Anchor methodology. I want to highlight that because we believe strongly that that's important. We think workers and the public deserve to know how living wage is being determined and what the methodology is behind it. So we work closely with the Global Living Wage Coalition and the anchors on that effort. All right, data. Great, good, wonderful. We got over the initial hump. Data is only good when it inspires action, and data is never fine for its own sake. It is only good if we're using it in a positive way. So after requiring all of our companies to collect data and analyze the data, we then required all of our companies to develop an internal blueprint that has time-bound priorities for where they are going to start implementing change in their supply chain alongside their suppliers. In 2021, they all had to publish details about that plan. 97% of our companies as of today have done that. You can go to their websites and see what they've done. And Veronique will give one really amazing example of that. Those are the requirements. We evaluate those efforts. And most importantly, what we require is that our companies that we work with are establishing very strong systems, both internally in their own headquarters and alongside their suppliers, to ensure that every department, planning, costing, obviously very important, design, sourcing, all the way up to top management, everyone is on board with the need for a living wage and has strong systems to hold each other accountable for it. Every person in every one of those departments and more has to be held accountable for making sure that a living wage is possible. And that's what we at FLA really think of when we think of purchasing practices. All of our accredited companies are evaluated on purchasing practices beyond wages. They must have internal policies, procedures. They must have accountability mechanisms. They must have strong dialogue with workers and with suppliers, and they must have strong incentive structures. And then they have to implement all of that and give us data to show that it is working. One of the ways we do that is we look at the results of factory assessments. If there are excessive overtime violations, rest day violations, et cetera, that's immediately a flag that something needs to change, and it might be at the brand level, not necessarily at the factory level. So that's what we hold our affiliates accountable for. And we're particularly proud of a small group of affiliates. You'll hear from one of them next when Veronique speaks, who really undertook very significant efforts with specific suppliers and factories to make changes that would help increase wages. What we saw was that in those cases, net wage increased between 29 and 57% over just 2 to 3 years, in all cases exceeding inflation, and in all cases meeting the Global Living Wage Coalition estimates. So it is possible. It is so difficult, but it is possible. And that's why we're happy to have Veronique from Puma here to share her experience. And I'm going to stop there because I think it's important that we hear. I think it's important that we hear from some experiences on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Renee. That's also a thrilling story, also about progress and some courageous decisions on throwing out earlier tools to come to better tools and more simple tools. Thank you. So we will move to our next speaker, who represents the well-known brand Puma. Puma is a member of ILO Better Work and of the Fair Labor Association. Puma has been working on sustainability for a long time, including on living wages. Veronique Rochet, Senior Head of Sustainability, will share the experience of Puma with the wage issue and how Puma made use of the FLA tools. Floor is yours, Veronique.
Thank you, Jos. And thank you, Renee, for the introduction. So just to give you a little bit of an introduction, Puma is a sport brand. So we are designing, developing product and selling footwear, apparel, and accessories since the last 65 years. Puma sustainability strategy is defined by what we call the 10 for 25. So it's 10 focus area where we set target to be reached by 2025. And this is reviewed every 5 years. We include in our code of conduct fair compensation in an alignment with the FLA code of conduct. Our code of conduct has to be posted in the factory. And in this code of conduct, and I forgot to say that it's actually translated in 50 different languages, so workers can have access to the content. In each code of conduct poster, there's a contact details for to Puma staff to raise concerns from the workers. So we have a direct hotline accessible to them. On top of our code of conduct, we also develop what we call the social handbook, which is published in our website, where we define our expectation to suppliers as well as our standards. So in 2020, let's say in 2019, we had an annual stakeholder meeting in our headquarters in Germany. And this came with the very clear, where Puma presented the strategy and tried to define what would be the next 5 years focus area. Fair compensation came really on the top of the agenda. So we published our 10 for 25 in 2020 that actually include fair compensation. So the way we work is actually to really address the root cause and use fair wage network assessment, use FLA dashboard that is also very useful information and easy tool to communicate internally. But on top of this, we also work on ensuring that workers' representatives are freely elected in our core factories, as well as ensuring that workers are paid digitally by the factory. Sounds like pretty amazing, but yes, there are still some gap here to be sure that especially female workers, that they receive their salary in hand. In 2018, Puma committed to responsible recruitment, a commitment put together by FLA and the American Apparel Footwear Association. And we've been working since then to really engage with our factories to map the foreign migrant workers what have been paid for their own recruitment, and engage with the factory for them to pay back. We also engage with the immigration organization, the International Organization for Migration, who are really expert and can help really to guide factories in this sense. So we also have how we are incentivizing suppliers to improve their grading after the audit is done. In 2017, we launched what we call Puma, a vendor financing program in collaboration with IFC, with BNP, HSBC, and now lately with Standard Chartered. So this system is that the higher grade the factory get after the audit, the best interest rate they can have, and they can have access to finance. This has been pretty successful in terms of in the situation like COVID, to really release the burden of the cash flow issue for the factory, for example. And in 2019, only 10% eligible supplier used this program, but in 2020, 30% of them use it. So we could really see in terms of not only rewarding, but really to safeguard our factory business, but also safeguard workers' income. Those kind of program has been helpful. I'm going to stop there, and I guess we can talk about the case later, right, Josh? Right. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Veronique. Very interesting, your story about migrant workers, the recruitment fee, access to finance, all related to the wages that the workers in the end will get and their purchasing power. We will move on now to towards ACT, the initiative that has engaged a large group of global brands to work with Industrial on promotion of collective bargaining agreements in production countries, and at the same time focusing on responsible purchasing practices. Bea Maria Ruoff is leading ACT's work on responsible purchasing practices, from development to monitoring and accountability measures. Bea is an expert on wage setting and labor policies. Prior to joining ACT, she researched already wage setting in global production networks. Bea will share the latest results of the ACT efforts. Bea, floor is yours.
Thank you. We're also absolutely thrilled to being part of this forum. As a part of the ACT Memorandum of Understanding with Industrial, the Global Trade Union Federation of Garment and Textile Workers, ACT brands have committed to facilitate the payment of a living wage through their purchasing practices. There's no accountability without commitments. So let me summarize the global purchasing practices commitments that all ACT brands have adopted. These are to include wages as itemized costs in purchasing prices, to fair terms of payments, better planning and forecasting, training on responsible sourcing and buying, and practicing responsible exit strategies. To monitor and measure progress towards implementation of these 5 commitments, ACT has developed an accountability and monitoring framework. It includes clear targets for each commitment, indicators, and monitoring instruments. One example for the commitment on including wages at itemized costs is the target that all brands and all suppliers surveyed report that the ACT labor costing protocol is used for 100% of volume. This is measured through an indicator, the percentage of volume which the labor costing protocol is applied. So that's just one example. And how is this monitored? As a regular monitoring tool, we have developed a brand and a supplier survey. They include questions that correspond to the target and indicator that I just mentioned, and all other targets and indicators that were set. 32 targets actually in total. The brand and the supplier surveys were rolled out for all ACT member brands and the suppliers in 2021. These are the largest surveys into purchasing practices of international brands and retailers carried out to date. I will post the link to the survey results later in the chat. The results of these surveys, together with further documentation, serve as a baseline. We will then produce progress reports against that baselines. We will also ensure continuous feedback from affected stakeholders through communication with suppliers and trade unions, as well as a confidential communication channel for them to raise concerns and complaints. Now, you may wonder how we can enable living wages with the tools I have just explained. As we have heard in the input of Daniel and Joss and also all other panelists so far, purchasing practices have an impact on wage payments. So it is important to understand them and to be able to take action. But there's no mechanism that, for example, a higher purchasing price or better planning and forecasting automatically trickles down to wage increases for workers. The decisive factor in the ACT approach towards living wages is that we support a mechanism. We think living wages can at best be achieved through collective bargaining at industry level, supported by purchasing practices. Responsible purchasing practices can create an environment that enables employers and employees to bargain collectively, also on wages. What needs to be included in order to achieve living wages? We think that 3 criteria must be met during wage agreements at industry level. They must include a substantial wage growth that is at least above inflation plus productivity growth. They must be based on full respect of freedom of association, and they must include a robust monitoring and enforcement. ACT is working on different building blocks towards collective bargaining and living wages. One of the building blocks are responsible purchasing practices. The other ones are freedom of association and supply chain social dialogue. Low wages are a systemic problem in the garments and textiles industry, and ACT offers a systemic approach to address this and achieve living wages in the industry. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Bea, for your contribution and mentioning the targets, the indicators, and also the criteria which will enable you to assess progress. I was especially happy with what you mentioned, that the substantial wage growth has to be above inflation rates. Which is specifically important these days with inflation rising worldwide. After these interesting presentations, I like to pose some questions to the panelists. One outcome of the ACT survey is that suppliers consider fair price negotiations